Okay, hi, good afternoon. I'm Professor Naomi Sokoloff, and as chair of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization, it's my honor to welcome you all today, and especially the members of the Ziadeh family who are here. Today's presentation is part of a distinguished lecture series in Arabic and Islamic Studies named in honor of Professor Farhat Ziadeh. As many of you know, he was an eminent scholar of Islamic law, a barrister, a highly regarded teacher, the author of textbooks that served to train generations of students of Arabic language. And indeed, he was a leading figure in the formative years of the entire field of Middle Eastern studies in the United States. Among other things, he founded our department, Near Eastern Languages and Civilization. That was in the year 1970. He served as the first chair of the department. He founded the Middle East Center, which is in the Jackson School of International Studies, and which has been the recipient of Title VI funds for many decades. And he held many offices in scholarly organizations at the national and international level. Today's lecture is a special occasion also because it is one of the first in-person public events that the department has held since the COVID pandemic shut down the campus in 2020. So we're very happy to see you here today. We do understand that some people are reluctant to attend in-person events or they're unable to, and so we are recording the lecture. That recording will be available through a link on our website. Okay, so you can follow up afterward, and you please do let other people know if they want to listen. Before we begin, let me offer thanks to our department administrator, Patrick Gibbs, and our, wave, everybody knows, okay, and our program assistant, Rick Aguilar, for their logistical help with this event. And also I would like to acknowledge the staff in the advancement office, and with special gratitude, those who've supported the endowment that makes the annual Ziadeh Lecture possible. The inaugural lecture in this series was given in the year 2002, and now could not have sustained this ongoing leadership without your help. With your continuing support, we will be able to organize more such events in the future. So with that, let me turn the podium over to another member of the NELC faculty, Professor Terry DeYoung, who teaches Arabic language, literature, cinema, and culture here at UW, and she also teaches Quran and other aspects of Islamic studies. And she will introduce today's guest speaker.
So I was recently on medical leave, and I'm just getting back to being normally walking. So it takes me a while, but I still can get to where I have to go. And I want to thank Naomi for that nice introduction, and to remind you that this is the 18th Ziadeh Distinguished Lecture that we have given since 2002. We've had a couple of years where we didn't have lectures for one reason or another. And last year and the year before that were years in which we didn't have lectures as we wished, but we're glad to be resuming with such a distinguished guest, with Professor Nasr as our lecturer this time. And today we'll be hearing a presentation by Professor Nasr, who is the Majid Hadouri Professor of International Affairs and Middle Eastern Studies. What a mouthful. But certainly well-deserved, because Professor Hadouri was a great scholar. Yeah. And he's at the Polnitsky School of Advanced International Studies of Johns Hopkins University, where he served as dean of that school between 2012 and 2019. So we're lucky to have snared him so soon after his finishing with that. And he's going to be speaking today about a new era of the United States and the Middle East, a topic that I'm sure will be of interest, as it is to me, to everybody here, given the whirlwind of changes in world politics in the last few months and their implications for an area we are all concerned with. And I think I can say that with confidence for this select and very professional audience. I'm also sure that Professor Nasr's insights on this topic, and I've taken the liberty of reading his most recent work, as well as using his book on the Shia revival for the entire course that I've been teaching this last spring on Introduction to Shiism. So it was very welcome that your chapter specifically on the background of Shiism was one that I recommended to all my students as a good brief introduction. We went a little bit longer, but still it was great. And Professor Nasr's insights on this topic would have been of the greatest interest to Professor Ziadeh himself, given that they have a shared commitment to bridging intellectual life and public policy work. As Naomi was mentioning, Professor Ziadeh not only founded the Near East Department, which has now become the Middle East Department, and will be in the future have a slightly different acronym to it. So sometimes I'll say NILK and sometimes I'll say milk. But as with so many things, we're in a transition here. And so we're getting used to that, or at least I am. And besides founding the NILK department, Professor Ziadeh also directed the Middle East Center, which is associated with the UW-Jackson School of International Studies. And some of you are here from that school for many years. And he helped to found the Middle East Studies Association with its emphasis on the Middle East in the modern world. So I think it's quite fitting. I was reading that you said this in one of your interviews a few years ago about bridging public policy and intellectual life. And I certainly saw that in the Shia revival, but I think it's also very clear in many of the other things that you've done. So Professor Nasr was born in Tehran and came with his family to the United States following the Iranian Revolution of 1979. And he graduated from Tufts University, summa cum laude, very soon after he came here. And he obtained his PhD in 1991 from the Political Science Department at MIT, which then and still does have quite a reputation for exactly trying to do this, to bridge the real world with more academic and abstract ideas. And so his mentors there, I found this out, included Professors Lucian Pai and Myron Weiner, who are eminent political scientists. And I'm sure that must have been a very heady atmosphere to be working in at the time. And all of Professor Nasr's work since is focused on various permutations of this goal of combining the real world with academic interests and studies. And he worked as senior advisor to Ambassador Richard Holbrooke in the Obama administration. And he is currently, although correct me if I'm wrong, non-resident fellow of South Asian Studies at the Atlantic Council. And in a more traditional academic setting, as I mentioned, he was dean for 7 years of the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. So he's received a number of grants and fellowships from the MacArthur Foundation, the Guggenheim Foundation, and the Social Science Research Council, to name just a few. And he's written more than 20 monographs and articles on Asian and Middle Eastern topics in both academic and policy contexts. A monograph that has recently been reissued is his concise and wonderfully discerning guide to the Shia revival, which I mentioned earlier, which is a resource I've constantly had at hand in teaching my course on Shiism this quarter, and I can personally recommend most highly. Most recently, he's published in Foreign Affairs in January-February issue of this year, 2022, All Against All, the Sectarian Resurgence in the Post-American Middle East, whose insights, I believe, are directly relevant to today's lecture about the new era of the United States in the Middle East. So without any more delay, because I'm really anxious to hear what you have to say, I'll get out of the way.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much, Professor DeYoung, for that very kind introduction. And I want to also thank Near East Languages and Civilizations for inviting me to University of Washington, and Patrick for his help. And I want to also thank and recognize the Ziadeh family for also including me in this celebration of Professor Ziadeh. I had the pleasure of meeting him years ago when I was a graduate student early in my career, and fully share the appreciation for the contribution that he made to the study of the Middle East in the United States, and particularly in developing it on the West Coast, which literally was non-existent for a very long period of time. And it's good to meet the members of the family, including my good friend, Ambassador Ziadeh, and also seeing a lot of good friends here today. So, there's a lot of, there used to be a time when the only sort of major international crisis was always about the Middle East. And sort of maybe it's been a period of relief the past few years that there are other sort of urgent global threats that have taken over, from China to COVID and now to Ukraine. It's always amusing for me to turn on the television and hear all the adjectives that was used about the Muslim world and the Middle East and its leaders, except it's not about the Middle East. It's about somewhere else, and we can for once be observers. But having said that, we're also in a very interesting time period, which is interesting academically and intellectually, but is also interesting in terms of policy, and then they do intersect. Is that inevitably, the place that the United States has in America's foreign policy imagination is changing in very profound ways. It's necessary for it to change. The Middle East is changing, the United States is changing, and the old order doesn't hold. But it's not clear where we're heading. And again, some of the assumptions that, just like some of the assumptions that kept the United States in the Middle East for so long came under question. Now some of the assumptions about its departure from the Middle East are again open to question. I mean, at least historically, we thought for a very long period of time that there were three things that really kept the United States in the Middle East. So one was security issues, and I'll talk about that a bit more. That was very broadly writ. Second was the issue of oil, and third was the issue of Israel. And for a very long time, we understood Israel to be about Arab-Israeli issue, about Palestinians and Israelis. And now that seems to, at least in the eyes of Israelis, to be a non-issue. So that issue is gone. Then we thought that oil really didn't matter because of the changes in the global energy situation, where the United States no longer buys Middle Eastern oil. This whole sort of move towards green energy, towards climate consciousness, that the Middle East would be downgraded, and if we don't need the oil, then we don't need to worry about it. But the security issue has persisted, largely about the issue of Iran, about which we can talk a bit more. But as we're speaking, the president is going to the Middle East. He's going to Israel. He's not going to be talking about the Arab-Israeli issue. I'm sure there's going to be sort of a throw here and there reference to peace process, but it's not really meaningful. It's going to be about Iran and Israel. So Israel matters again, but not in the ways that it did for a very long period of time. And then because of the Ukraine crisis, there's renewed interest in energy. I mean, we could look at gas prices coming here. It's now a domestic issue again. And then the onset thing about the Ukraine war is that cutting Russia out of the gas and oil markets is going to force many third world countries to go back to oil and coal. And so Saudi Arabia, its level of production, etc., is again not an issue just for American security, that the president would like lower gas prices, but it's really about also much more broadly, it's about energy consumption around the world. So this is still an open question. In other words, what does the United States want in the Middle East? How it can achieve it? And how it can balance these things? And I would love to hear your thoughts as at the end, and for us to have a conversation. Now, for a very long period of time after the Iranian Revolution, at least if we sort of create that as a marker, American policy in the Middle East was very clearly about protecting the region from the Iranian Revolution, and Iran began to replace the Soviet Union as the primary threat to Middle East security. So, there's a long history of American presidents issuing doctrines of security to the Middle East, starting with the Truman Doctrine about the Soviet Union. And there was the Eisenhower Doctrine, which was about the United States protecting the region from communism. Then there was the Nixon Doctrine, which essentially gave the protection of the Middle East to be managed by Iran under the Shah at the time, with the United States providing support. And then after the Iranian Revolution, there was the Carter Doctrine, which basically committed the United States to protect the Middle East from what might be an Iranian threat to the region. There hasn't been formal doctrines all along, but you could think about an Obama doctrine, and now about a Biden doctrine, which are really about a very different kind of an approach to the Middle East. But at least since 1979, the United States came to see that Middle East security means no more revolutions and no more Islamic revolutions. So the entire idea of containment of Iran, American strategy in the Middle East, was built on being about keeping Iran inside of a wall within its own borders, no coups, no export of revolution, no encroachment on security of the region, no more toppling of pro-American regimes. But the United States policy also became, with the exception maybe in Afghanistan, which was not seen as Middle East at the time, of being also antagonistic towards Islam and politics. Now, you could say the idea of Islam being involved in politics sort of ran counter to secular sensibilities in American foreign policy, but a lot of it had to do with the image that the Iranian Revolution portrayed of what Islamic politics means, which means it's anti-imperialist, anti-American. It's disruptive. If anybody thought about religious forces taking away social liberties, putting women under hijab, and at the same time also politically being extremely aggressive against American interests, that essentially these two were the two sides of the same coin. So, and you could say the United States built a rather successful strategy in the Middle East. It created an alliance of Arab regimes, if I would say dictatorships, some monarchies, some republics. It was built on the back of the Camp David Accords and the opening to Egypt, but then included a host of Arab countries. Now, not all of these Arab countries had relations with the US, like Syria or Iraq, but they nevertheless were building blocks within the American containment system, perhaps managed by Saudi Arabia and Egypt. So the most important country in containing Iran was Iraq, even though it had no relations with the United States, but Iraq had relations with Saudi Arabia, etc. So they all sort of shared the purpose of keeping Iran and Iranian revolution outside of the Arab world. And also these regimes, whether they were socialist, Ba'athist, pro-American monarchies, proved extremely successful at keeping Islam at bay. So in fact, one could say that the reason why so many Islamists and activists showed up ultimately in Afghanistan largely had to do with because they were basically flushed out of their own countries. There was no possibility for them to remain active and organized in Egypt or in Jordan or in Tunisia or in Saudi Arabia. They all ended up in Afghanistan. There was a period where Saudi Arabia gladly gave a one-way airline ticket to anybody who wanted to go and join the jihad in Afghanistan, hoping, I guess, that they would be martyred in the process. Not all war, but what we saw for a long period of about 2 decades, that there was no if you would, repeat of Iranian revolution. There was not even a successful Islamist uprising. Yes, there was the assassination of Sadat. Yes, there were periodic acts of violence against tourists in Egypt, but none of them really amounted to something that you would call equivalent to a kind of a social movement that really threatened the Arab order. And the logic in Washington around this containment was pretty much built on the same way that the United States had looked at anti-communism in the 60s, 50s, etc. And as the support for regimes that you don't share the values of, but nevertheless get the job done. There is reliance on a lesser evil of dictatorships in order to contain the larger evil, which is a much larger ideological disruptive force out there. And I have to say that the United States is particularly vulnerable to this kind of a strategy because the conception of values in its foreign policy matters more than any other country. So there are serious debates and there are serious vacillations, if you would say, that Hosni Mubarak could be our very good friend for 37 years until people showed up in Tahrir Square, then all of a sudden he must go, which is sort of repeat of what happened with the Shah. But this has more to do with the mindset of the United States and this sort of vacillating between promotion of values versus promotion of what are fundamental interests, and has anything to do with the factors on the ground. And a big component of this strategy was also the peace process industry, I would say. I mean, in reality, Camp David Accords were for real, but everything after that, you had decades of an effort to build a peace process, which eventually in Washington literally produced a industry around people who were working on this, promoting this, their careers were attached to this. But it didn't go anywhere. The closest it came was to post Oslo peace process was to a deal between then the Israeli government and Arafat, and that fell apart. And in the meantime, actually Israel began to drift further and further towards a notion that land first, peace sometime in the future, if ever, under Netanyahu. But what at least you would say is if you sort of went further out, to 10,000 feet from this picture, for the region it provided the basis of how the United States could have both Israel and the Arabs. How could it sustain a containment wall against Iran while also remaining so committed to Israeli security? So pivotal to that was that the Palestinian issue has to be locked in some kind of a positive conversation between Arabs and Israelis. Even though you would say Israel, under Netanyahu in particular, had no real such commitment. But that containment basically was sustainable partly because the Palestinian issue never became a disruptor between the United States and the Arab regimes on the region. Now, there were problems along the way. For instance, when Saddam Hussein decided to invade Kuwait and basically had his own agenda, he sort of won the war against Iran, quote unquote, in 1988. Had 1 million men under arms, did not want to demobilize them, and turned down an offer by Washington when they sent Donald Rumsfeld there that somehow he would become another Sadat in the region, and decided that he was going to be the Napoleon of the Arab world. I mean, build Iraq into a major state on the back of invasion, reconstitution of territory, etc. And his approach to Kuwait, not very different from the way perhaps Putin thinks about Ukraine. It was sort of a reconstituting what is a conceptual idea of a greater Iraq. And that was obviously a problem because this was a major crack within the internal wall of containment, because countries that were threatened here were the countries that matter to the United States most, which is Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf littoral states. The elder George Bush actually handled this particularly looking at it with benefit of hindsight, very masterfully. In other words, he's been credited for deciding not to go to Baghdad, not toppling Saddam, because then he would own it, as Powell said. But actually, not going to Baghdad and not toppling Saddam at that point also had the much more important benefit of maintaining the containment. In other words, at that time, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, they all understood that Saddam had misbehaved. It was not sustainable, but that if Iraq goes, there is no containment of Iran. That Iraq is the most important country to the containment of Iran. That's historically been true. You know, you go back to the fall of the Persian Empire in 7th century. The Mesopotamia is where the capital of the Sassanids was and was toppled by Arab forces invading, and Saudis or the rest of the Arabs on Iran's border don't threaten Iran. They don't threaten Iran not only because they don't have the manpower, the military, but even where they're located is not a threat to Iran. But Iraq, even geographically speaking, this is the pathway to the Iranian plateau. It's always been. Right, is through the plains of Iraq. And during the Ottoman period, there was seesaw battles between the Safavids and the Ottomans over control of Iraq. And then, in the 1960s and 70s, there was this competition between Iran and Iraq. Iraq is not only well located to do this, it has a history of animus with Iran, which goes many, many years. And secondly, it also had the military capability, the manpower capability, the size of the country, the resources, even though it was smaller than Iran, to basically pose the kind of threat that would keep Iran out of the Arab world. And so toppling Saddam at that point in time basically meant no containment. So the United States came up with a kind of a nimble strategy of what at that point in time was called dual containment, which means that you contain Iraq and Saddam through sanctions, etc., but you also contain Iran by maintaining Iraq and maintaining that Arab order around Iran. And so Iran still remained behind the wall. And I think that's probably, I would say, is the point at which the United States exercised the most amount of dexterity in understanding its strategy and doing things that protected its strategy. So, but then I have to say that from then on it's downhill. I mean, increasingly American strategy on the Middle East begins to become troubled because its goals are not clear and not set against one another. Now, I'll explain. The turning point comes in 2001. With 9/11 and the constitution of the entire strategy of war on terror. So even though technically on the ground Iran and the United States remained antagonistic, the war on terror is not a containment of Iran's strategy. Actually, by virtue of what it says, it's a containment of Islam's strategy. Right, or Islamic extremism. We can debate about where the boundary lines between Islam and extremism was in the administration, but it's very clear that when the administration decided to actually not stop at defeating Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, not basically say, okay, just like Bush Sr. had done, when Saddam went into Iraq, he didn't construct a whole new strategy. He basically said there's a crack in the old strategy. It can be fixed by putting the right Band-Aid on it, which is we kick him out of Kuwait. We put put him under also lock and key, but the overall strategy of containing Iran remains intact. There was such a possibility in 9/11. The United States very early on defeated Al-Qaeda. It decimated the organization. They went on the run. They were expelled from Afghanistan. The Taliban fell. The administration could have handled it that way as well. Say, there was a problem here. It's taken care of. There's a Band-Aid on it. We go back to the same old Middle East strategy of containing Iran. But instead, it actually continued on the war on terror as a master strategy for the United States. So you have 2 decades Middle East strategy being about things that it was before 9/11, but at the same time being about 9/11. So it became but then, there are incongruities here. When the United States went after Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, its main ally was Iran. The same General Soleimani, who years later the Americans would assassinate in Iraq, was also the mastermind of giving access to Iranian territory to American forces to be able to bomb and operate in northern Afghanistan. He was the main organizer or outside supporter of the Northern Alliance. He's a very close friend of Shah Ahmad Massoud, and he was very instrumental. The Revolutionary Guards were very instrumental in opening the door to Northern Alliance to the United States. And then when he was at the United States tried to give Afghanistan a new government, its main partner in crime at the Bonn conference were Iranians, who worked very closely with the United States in order to finish the war in Afghanistan. But then the conflict comes about that as soon as you cooperated with them there, then immediately the United States said, well, Iran is a member of the axis of evil. So in the larger war on terror, Iran was an ally. And after all, this obviously comes out much later. Iranians are Shia. They obviously understood Al-Qaeda and Islamic extremism represents a particularly virulent form of Sunni Islam, which is inherently anti-Shia. They had almost gone to war with the Taliban in 1994 over massacre of Iranian journalists and diplomats because they were Shia. There was no love lost there. They thought that the United States and Iran had common goals when it comes to fighting extremism. But the US strategy was not clear here, right? So it wanted to fight Islamic extremists who, ideologically or otherwise would be antagonistic towards Iran, and Iran could be an ally. But very quickly, as soon as it won in Afghanistan, it reverted back to saying we're back at the same containment strategy. Now, 9/11 had other sorts of, the war on terror had other sorts of problems as well. First of all, it was a strategy that was not built around confronting nation states. Right? It was a strategy that was built around containing and confronting asymmetric groups, if you want to call it, terrorist groups, but groups that we actually ourselves said don't have territory. They are all over the place. They may be in Brussels, or they may be in Kabul, or they may be in Baghdad, or they may be anywhere. But for a major global power to construct a regional strategy that is not actually around actual nation states was a problem. America's allies in this effort were themselves had been sort of implicated at some level in the rise of Al-Qaeda. And then also the war on terror very quickly became not a foreign policy issue for the United States, it was a domestic policy issue. I mean, for 2 decades, the war on terror had legs and had resilience, not because it made sense in terms of American foreign policy, but rather because it became a sticky issue domestically. In terms of our domestic politics. This fear of terrorism, fear of Islam, no politician, no president could basically back away. So, candidate Obama could promise that he's going to close the Guantanamo Bay, but President Obama couldn't do it for the simple reason that it was a domestic political issue. Then the other fundamental problem to the war on terror is that the idea of war on terror was built around the idea of democracy promotion. So the assumption of the administration was that Islamic politics is a consequence of a democracy deficit in the region. But guess what? Who's been supporting the democracy deficit? It's been the United States. All of the United States allies are the very countries that we now are saying they have a democracy deficit. Although Washington would like to talk about democracy deficit only when it came to Iraq and Iran, but not when it came to its allies. And as a result, there were some moments of incredulity, like when Secretary Condoleezza Rice went to Cairo to give a lecture about the terrible impact of dictatorship on the Middle East, which is sort of irony of ironies at that point in time, that you would lecture Egyptians on the problem. Now, even aside from the fact that democracy promotion really put to question the logic of American policy, it is a fuzzy concept, right? I mean, as a goal of, comparative politics scholars in political science can talk a lot about, what factors are required for democracies to emerge, in the short run, in the long run. There's a lot of debate about conditions that promote democracy. But for foreign policy purposes, it's not clear what democracy promotion really means. What are you actually promoting, right? Is it an election? Is it a system? And that's exactly what got us into overreach and confusion in both Iraq and Afghanistan, right? In terms of what we're dealing with. And secondly, what is democracy promotion going to achieve? Is democracy promotion going to achieve security for the region? So if all the Arab countries become democratic, is it going to be more secure? Is that what we're saying? But our strategy in the region was not built around this concept. Was built around existence of order and authority that can keep Iran out and keep Islam at bay. And nobody ever gave an answer how democracy would do that better. Or can democracy do it at all? In fact, more than likely, democracy would open the door, as we saw after the Arab Spring, for Islamic forces to come to power, if you really gave people the vote. And the United States was shocked that when in Iraq later on, democracy would bring all the religious parties from both sides to power, and then also that it brought ethnic sectarian consciousnness, which we didn't even factor in. Now, the war on terror also led the United States down the path of the war in Iraq, which is, a lot has been said about it. The folly of it, etc., the mismanagement post-war. But the most important issue about it was that it essentially purported to remove the Arab state that was most important to containment of Iran. And if the goal was for Iran not to penetrate the Arab world, removing Iraq basically was the beginning of the collapse of the Arab order around Iran. And on top of it, it opened other Pandora's boxes about which we hadn't thought about, namely that the Middle East is not about democracy versus dictatorship. There are other fights that matter. And the most important of these was sectarian fights. I mean, we never took into consideration that the states in the Middle East may be secular in name, but the distribution of wealth, power, etc., are along identity lines, and these identity lines don't reflect the majority-minority dimension of the population. So Iraq was a country that is divided between Kurd and Arab. Kurds are Sunni by and large, but they don't identify with Sunni Arabs. So among the Arab population, overwhelming majority, something like 65% and more, are Shia. Now, they identify as such because they lived in a society in which basically distribution of power and resources was along those lines. The Iraqi military was by and large Shia because conscript soldiers come from the majority population, but the Republican Guards, which was the sort of Praetorian Guard that protected the Iraqi regime, was Sunni to the last man, right? Many people kept saying, when I wrote the book Shia Revival, there's no such thing, there's no sectarianism, we all used to live together, etc. It's true among a certain certain segment of society. But when you talk to those same people more at length, they would tell you, well, look, I couldn't get business loans because they went to those sorts of to those other groups, or you had to be a Sunni and to be from Saddam's city in order to have access to resources of power. And if really sectarianism didn't matter, why did Saddam Hussein execute every Shia member of the Ba'ath Party after the Iranian Revolution? I mean, he clearly understood that there is such a thing as sectarianism in Iraq. But we were oblivious to that. That this is not the Iraqis are not. Yes, they are Iraqis, like many other Indians are Indians, but it depends on, are you Hindu Indian, are you a Muslim Indian? It does make a difference. And nowadays you could say about the United States. I mean, which American are you in terms of your political understanding, etc. But it essentially broke down the wall of containment against Iran, although we didn't see it at that point in time. The perception in Washington, particularly very early in the war, was that we've overthrown Iraq, we're going to overthrow Iran in no time, right? So there was a mistake in reading the success of the American military to dismantle a whole military into understanding that you can actually manage what comes later. It would take 2-3 years before the United States would understand that the 2-3 weeks until you got to Baghdad was the easy part. What happened after you came to Baghdad, that was the much bigger issue. But now looking with benefit of hindsight, the issues that are standing between Iran and the United States now were really born in a new way in 2003. So the Iranians understood very well when Dick Cheney would say, today in Baghdad, tomorrow in Tehran, that the Iraq war is really about them, that the US is thinking that it can have a final solution for the Middle East. It doesn't need containment. That's the way the neocons used to think under President Bush, that it's not necessary to play this game. You could remove these regimes quickly. Democracy will come to the region. You'll be done with Islam. You'll be done with anti-Americanism. You'll be even done with the Arab-Israeli issue. And that there is no need for compromise. There's no need to talk to Iranians. So in 2003, right after the fall of Baghdad, Iran's president then wrote a letter to the White House and sent it through the intermediary of the Swiss embassy in Iran, basically saying that Iran is willing to talk about everything. And the US basically decided this is a sign of weakness. Why talk to them? And they actually they denied that the letter was from Iran, and they chastised the Swiss for actually delivering it. And they said no. So then the Iranians basically decided that they have to make the United States fail in Iraq. That's a deterrent strategy. So the entire campaign that was started by General Soleimani then of building IEDs, trying to kill the American campaign in Iraq with 1,000 cuts, continuous attacks on the Americans, etc. And they learned a lot also from the insurgency that the Sunnis started in Iraq. Had to do exactly with sort of a deterrent strategy by Iran. And that obviously led to the so-called Quds force in Iran becoming far more powerful, as it was given the mission of handicapping the US in Iraq, but also it created the sort of anger and animus that now exists between United States and Iran to this day, and these issues about Iran's regional presence, Iran's backed militias, etc. In the region. Iraq also had another consequence, which is generally it weakened, it brought to the fore the sort of sectarian dimension of the Middle East. Now, I'm not saying that sectarianism is everything, but it's also a mistake to deny that identity doesn't matter, right? That if you went before the Iraq War, Americans' conception of the Middle East was generally a Sunni conception, right? The leaders that the United States knew were all Sunni. No American president had met a Shia leader since the Shah of Iran, not until Nouri al-Maliki, came. And the Shah was not a religious person in that sense, but basically we had been in 2-3 decades of essentially being allies with the Sunni part of the Middle East. We didn't see it, but this mattered to the region. Why? Because Iran's revolution, even though it said it's Islamic, was really a Shia revolution. I mean, that's unavoidable. I mean, Khomeini may never use the term Shia, but he's a Shia. I mean, when the Iranian Revolution happened, Muammar Gaddafi said, what is this thing called Ayatollah that we don't have any of and Iran has 82, right? So if, as Khomeini was trying to position himself to say, I'm the leader of the Islamic world, the Saudis and others basically said, no, just look at him. Does he look like the religious leaders that you've known? The answer is no. And so Iran could never actually divorce its Shiism early on. And so this was sort of embedded there. The collapse of Iraq, the fact that you had a Shia government take over Iraq, it actually made it much more difficult to go back to a kind of uniform Arab alliance that had contained Iran. Even as we are speaking today, you go above the head of the governments we like to speak. I mean, Iraq still has a Shia government. Even though it may become anti-Iranian, it still doesn't quite trust the rest of the Sunni region. It'll probably be much more neutral than it ever was. Syria's dictatorship, which has survived, is on the back of an alliance with Hezbollah and Iran. Lebanon, whatever you cut it, still the plurality of the population are Shia, and the largest, most powerful political force in the country is Shia. Yemen is involved in a civil war which has very clear sectarian tones between Houthis in the north and the south. And so it's difficult to sort of really couple together a strategy that unifies the Arab world against Shia Iran in the seamless way that it happened in the 80s and the 90s. And that's largely America's own fault. With the invasion of Iraq, that it actually created a situation where there is an anomaly, if you would, in the fundamental ways that we think about the region. We debased the very containment wall that we relied on for a number of decades. And this actually got worse with the Arab Spring. Now, you could say the Arab Spring did to the Arab world what the United States did to Iraq, which is to bring down a number of Arab dictatorships, which then opened the door for explosions from below. There are two kinds of Arab states, and I'm sort of very much generalizing here. On North Africa side, you had the Germanys of the Middle East. Fairly unified populations where it's really about authoritarianism, social rights, democracy. The more you come east, the more you end up with Yugoslavias of the Middle East. Highly divided societies in which the distribution of power is at odds. So what happened in Iraq then happened in Syria, which is very quickly the fight against Assad became sectarian. And he actually helped stoke it, but nevertheless it did. In Yemen, in Bahrain, these issues all came to the fore. And the consequence was that essentially the Arab world began to collapse, right? In the way that the United States thought of it as a coherent unit that can contain Iran. It just began to fall apart. I mean, as we're talking, the three most important Arab states, the ones that were seat of great empires and power, which is Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, are a shadow of their previous existence. And Syria and Iraq, which were the seat of the great empires, Islamic empires, are actually not states anymore. I mean, they are states according to the United Nations, but the government in both of them just basically controls, by and large, the capital and its environments, and large parts of the country are either completely out of their control or are actually controlled or occupied by foreign forces. I mean, as we're speaking, Turkey is present in both northern Iraq and northern Syria. Iran is present in Syria. Israel is annexing the Golan Heights, right? So, and then the writ of the government doesn't really go that far outside of the capital. I mean, the Assad regime in Syria is in power thanks to Russia and to Iran. I mean, it's not capable of exercising force on its own. And then the countries that we think can contain Iran and the regional orders, Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc., cannot do so without the United States. They don't have the size of military, the depth, etc., to really stand up to these much larger forces. So, you know, what started by the United States in 2003 and culminated in 2011, I would say is generally an implosion of the Arab world as the center of the Middle East. I mean, as we are speaking, if we went a few decades back, the Arab world was the most powerful part of the Middle East. It's the one that kept the United States up at night. If you went to the 60s, 70s, 50s. Israel, Iran, and Turkey had to actually build an alliance to contain the Egyptians and the Baathists and Nasr, etc. Now it's the opposite. It's those powers that are competing with each other on Arab land, and the Arabs in most places are not capable of actually keeping them out without the United States or someone else helping them, right? So what we witnessed essentially is that the building blocks that United States relied on is actually rubble now. But the US strategy hasn't changed. It's still committed to containing Iran. Now, under the last three presidents, there is a sort of a real effort to try to come up with something else. So this started with Obama, who, you know, in his own cerebral way, you know, had thought about these and knows the region, knows the Middle East better than any other president, I would say, day one in the office. And he sort of figured that, look, we're not going to achieve anything in this region. Doesn't matter how much effort you put into democracy promotion, etc. It's kind of like wheels turning in the sand. And we're spending trillions of dollars, and we're spending enormous amount of diplomacy and military resources. And the big winner in the Middle East is actually China, which for 2 decades has been rising while we've been focused on this. So Obama never said it, but he literally thought that the war on terror is a fool's errand. This was a strategy that had taken America down a rabbit hole that actually didn't have an end. And the more you fought terrorism, the less you achieved. And these big events like Arab Spring, etc., had nothing to do with this. And places like Libya, you know, you again went in thinking you're going to bring in democracy. You ended up leaving because of Benghazi attacks. And so, you know, the best thing the United States could do was to leave the region. So he took some steps, like he didn't make much of a fuss leaving Iraq. We went down to 0 in terms of numbers in Iraq. He talked about leaving Afghanistan, although the problem there was that stickiness of the war on terror. I worked on that issue. It's very clear that, you know, as a president, he felt he didn't have much room to basically make a case that we need to leave Afghanistan. But he told the military, we're not going to stay indefinitely, and, you know, there's going to be a limited commitment. With Iran, he came to the conclusion that, look, you're not going to end up with peace with Iran, but you have to end up at a stable situation that allows us to leave. And that basically means a nuclear deal. If everybody thinks the next big war on the Middle East is going to be about Iran's nuclear weapons, so if you get to a deal, at least you buy 10 years of peace for the Middle East, and maybe the basis for something more, and the cause for war would be removed in the Middle East. And that's when he pursued a nuclear deal with Iran. It was not about making peace with Iran. It was an arms control deal, which is, you know, how do we stop them from keep building nuclear capability? And then when he came to Syria, he basically then put his foot down and he said, we're not going in. I don't care how many people are running away to Europe. I don't care what the atrocities are. We're just not going in. And there's the many things that the president said which were sort of turning points towards the end. I mean, he had an interview with the New Republic magazine where they asked him, you know, what about tens of thousands of people dying in Syria? And he said, well, tens of thousands of people are dying in the Congo as well, right? So essentially, this was realism, that Kissinger would be proud of, that in the sense of saying we don't have a dog in this fight, and humanitarian reasons are not good enough for us to get in. And anyways, I don't think Syria is more important than the Congo, right? That was his reading, although I don't think he was correct, because the refugee issue in Syria ended up causing tremendous turbulence in Europe. Secondly, is when he signed a deal with Iran, he told Saudi Arabia, you got to figure out to live with Iran. That basically means that the United States is not committed to containment anymore. When you tell the Saudis at that point, and that's the reason for that bitterness they had, was not about Iran's nuclear program, it was about all of a sudden the US deciding that it doesn't want to contain anymore. And he's telling them, we'll give you weapons, but don't look to us. You got to do it on your own. So these were sort of big shifts for the region. Maybe we didn't realize it, but psychologically for the Middle East, it was very clear that there's a new doctrine and a new strategy here. The United States is no longer committed to putting the amount of resources it put in the region, either to fight terrorism or to fight Iran or to protect its allies. It wants much more hands-off. Now, he never articulated it quite as a doctrine, but I think it was understood. And a lot of animus in the Arab world towards him is exactly because of this, because of the shift that he started. Now, the Trump era, in its own way, was a continuation. I think regardless of what President Trump says, he was also, when he was running as a candidate, was opposed to forever wars, wanted out of Afghanistan, wanted out of Iraq, and when he came to power, he did some of those. He withdrew U.S. troops from Afghanistan. He started the process of actually talking to the Taliban, right? Even inviting them to Camp David at one point. I mean, when I worked in the State Department, you would be hung by your neck if you suggested talking to the Taliban. But he could do it. And he started the process. He began talking about leaving Syria, about leaving Iraq. And also, he showed the Arabs also that he was not committed to containment. So, when he was very aggressive with Iran, he came out of the nuclear deal, he put, additional sanctions on Iran. But when the Iranians began to react, he showed that he's not going to actually defend the Arabs, right? So Iranians eventually, a year after they were under sanctions, they attacked tankers in the UAE port of Fujairah. No response from the US. They shot down an American drone, spy drone, over the skies of the Gulf. No reaction from the US. And then they attacked Saudi oil facilities in Abqaiq and Aramco, and no US reaction, right? So if you're in Saudi Arabia, you would decide, doesn't matter how many troops Americans have in the region, they're not committed to actually defending Saudi Arabia, right? They don't want to go to war. If you don't want to go to war, there's no such thing as containment, right? But Trump's strategy was confusing because he was simultaneously escalating with Iran and also talked about leaving the region. And he also was saying things to the region that they didn't like to hear, like, you have to pay us to protect you, right? You need to write the cost of the war in Syria. That's what he told the Saudis. You should be paying for the war in Syria, not the American people. And that's not the definition. That kind of transactional attitude is not what makes countries, small countries who rely on the United States for the security, actually feel secure, right? But one other very important thing President Trump did is actually he ended the war on terror. It was not done by a decree. It was largely, fundamentally, he made the argument at some level that the greatest threat to the United States is not Muslims or Arabs, it's Mexicans and it's Central Americans. I mean, he referred to MS-13 far more frequently than he referred to ISIS. And that the most important strategic thing that the United States can do is to build that wall. In other words, it was kind of like he woke up, particularly that wing of the American population and Republican Party, which was most attached to the idea of war in the Middle East, from kind of a trance. That why are we there fighting them when, quote unquote, our own country is being invaded, etc. You have to focus here. And during his time, and also with the entire focus domestically, war on terror began to dissipate as an idea. And that actually provided a lot more room to American policymakers to begin to seriously think about another strategy for the Middle East, right? Before that, as I said, domestically, presidents, politicians were hamstrung because war on terror had become a domestic issue. Nobody could back away from it. The idea of leaving Afghanistan was no president wanted to touch it. But when Trump announced it, when negotiations with the Taliban began, I challenge you, how many of you even remember? Right? It wasn't there. I mean, we were all focused on his tweets and we were focused on a whole host of other issues. But almost the most important thing, which is we're going to talk to the Taliban and leave Afghanistan, was never debated domestically. After 20 years and all of this huffing and puffing about imminent threats to the United States and how Al-Qaeda can attack us at any moment. I mean, when he stood up and said, we've defeated ISIS, what he basically, I think, he didn't mean literally we've defeated ISIS, although he might have thought that. But metaphorically, what it meant basically, we've defeated the idea. This is not an issue. This is an irritant. Just like migration used to be an irritant for previous administrations. Didn't mean it wasn't an issue, but they were focused on terrorism. Now it's reversed. Terrorism is an irritant, but the big issue for us is migration. So I'm not saying that he did this as a sitting down and calculating, but the sum result of was that essentially it created room for the United States to think of a different strategy with the Middle East. And then the Biden administration essentially picked up literally where Trump left off. No more, they finished the job of leaving Afghanistan. In fact, the president refused to even delay the date of departure by 2 months to make sure it would be more orderly. That we are talking about leaving Iraq by and large. The administration keeps saying we will stay in the Middle East. But everybody in the Middle East means that's meaningless. Because if you're not willing to use your forces, it doesn't matter if you're here or not. And most of the forces, like in Iraq or in Afghanistan towards the end, basically become force protection forces. You have 200 people who are advising, you have another 2,000 people who have to protect them. So you basically say we have 2,200 people. But these are not combat troops. Even for the last 2 years in Afghanistan, our soldiers were not fighting anymore. That's why there were no casualties. So, it was up to the Afghans to do it and they couldn't do it. So that's a whole different way of saying, yes, we're here, but we're not committed to protecting the region. Now, as we're speaking, there are still some issues the U.S. has to resolve, and it has not managed to do so. So one is that the more it has withdrawn from the region, the more we are seeing in the region a kind of competition that the United States was not prepared for. And the competition is a three-way competition between, maybe 4 ways if you count all of the Arab countries under Saudi Arabia, but it's really between Iran, Israel, and Turkey, about turf and influence. And they're fighting in Arab lands. And the most intense part of this is between Iran and Israel, in a way that might potentially get out of hand and have consequences of its own. But in Iraq, in Syria, all of three of them are present. They're all vying against one another. In Lebanon, they're all present. Turkey has moved into northern Lebanon in a major way, filling some of the gaps Saudis had left. Turkey's in occupation of significant swaths of land in Syria. I mean, first time since end of the Ottoman Empire, in both Idlib and also in the bordering Kurdish areas. It's a big presence in northern Iraq. The Iranians don't have actual that kind of occupied territory, but in a de facto way, they are present on the ground in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, and so all of them are trying to control the governments in these Arab countries. They are building factions. So you go to these countries, there's an element that is allied with Turkey. There's an element that's allied with Iran. And there's even in the Kurdish region of northern Iraq, there's now openly allied with Israel. So the three of them, the three non-Arab forces, are basically filling the vacuum that the U.S. left in a major way. I mean, much has been made about the Abraham Accords, but the Abraham Accords, in my opinion, was not about the Palestinians. It's not about the old Arab-Israel issue. It's really part of this competition. In other words, in this environment, UAE and Saudi Arabia decided that facing Iran and Turkey, that their basically natural ally is Israel. And whereas, Iran, at the height of their standoff with Qatar, Iran and Turkey were supporting Qatar against the Saudis. So sort of, we don't have a solution for this. In other words, there's no American, let's say, substitute regional order to replace containment. And then the region's looking at US, China, and then they're looking at Ukraine, and they've decided that, we're gone. We may say no, but we're gone. I mean, Ukraine is going to be a generational issue with Russia. However this war ends. In other words, Russia is now a major problem or a major concern on the eastern flank of Europe, on the eastern flank of NATO. Whether he's expelled out of Ukraine or he stays in Ukraine or whatever the outcome, that the United States for a number of years does not have the bandwidth to be engaged in the Middle East in a major way, and also be engaged in Europe, and then also be engaged in China. And that's part of the reason why Saudis and UAE were not eager to just support the president on his say-so over Ukraine. They understand that they're no longer, alliance begets alliance. If you're not committed to us, we need to look after our own sets of things. And then finally, the most important issue is the Iran nuclear deal. When President Obama contemplated this deal, the idea, as I said, was not a normalization with Iran. People all the time kept thinking about that this might be a Nixon to China moment. Although when Nixon went to China, we didn't know that China was going to open up. It took another decade before Deng Xiaoping took over. And who knows what might have happened. But realistically, the way Obama saw it, as I said, it was an arms control deal. You stop enriching, you get this, we verify, you verify, it's a deal. It's kind of like détente. It was kind of like deals we'd made with the Soviet Union in the 1970s. We can agree to hate each other, and we can agree that we're going to compete everywhere else in Africa, etc., but we agree to limit the number of our intercontinental ballistic missiles to a certain number. It creates stability between us. It reduces the likelihood that the arms race gets out of control. That was what the Iran nuclear deal was. Now, President Trump moved out under false assumptions that the Iranian government was going to imminently fall or is going to come on its knees to beg for a new deal. And it didn't. It doubled down on the fact that if you give in to the Americans, they're going to ask for more. I mean, after all, they had 2003 in their mind, that U.S. would construe any kind of an offer as a sign of weakness. And everything since then has gone wrong. In other words, Iran has become far more dangerous, and its nuclear program has become far bigger and far more disruptive. So, they decided that they're going to start enriching more over the past 4 years. Now, even if they give up everything that they've enriched, they've experimented with much more advanced centrifuges. They've learned a lot of things that makes them much more agile. And even if the deal is restored tomorrow, it will never restore the breakout period of two years that was in 2015. Because the Iranian advancement means that they can get to requisite amount of enriched uranium much faster. And also regionally they become more dangerous. They've become much more facile with attacks on Saudi forces and American bases in Iraq. There was blood, when Soleimani was assassinated. That sort of was a major, if you would, psychological impact on the hard side of Iran, which is in control. But all of that said, still the fact that there's not a deal between Iran and the United States as we speak, it makes it extremely difficult for the United States to envision a region that's not going to melt down in ways that we don't we worry. I mean, you mentioned my piece in Foreign Affairs. My argument there was that if there is no deal, ultimately you have a number of scenarios. First of all, the Iranians are not going to tolerate being with West's knee on their neck. In other words, choking their economy, choking their people. They're going to react somehow, right? Just because they're not doing it now is because they're involved in a process with the U.S. But at some point in time, they will react. Or that they will begin to enrich up to 90%. They already are enriching up to 60%, which is way ahead of what they had committed early on. They have a lot more nuclear capacity now. When President Trump became president, Iran's low-enriched uranium stockpile of low-enriched uranium was the same weight as the President of the United States. By the day he left office, Iran had over 3 tons of low-enriched uranium, right? So at some point, Israelis are basically going to say that, we're going to get more aggressive. They already are assassinating, doing campaign bombings. So see, there's a point at which Iran's going to react, right? So right now we're in a situation that we are, ironically, we are relying on Iranian discipline. I mean, basically, we're not, Israelis are attacking them at will. They're assassinating, IRGC commanders in Tehran. Tomorrow they may make another attack. If Iranians begin to enrich more, they may go again after the nuclear facilities. So there's one or two scenarios. Either we hope that the Iranians would show discipline and not react, or they're going to react. And if they react, then, it can go in many different directions. Now, why isn't there a nuclear deal? I mean, by and large, I think it is now a domestic issue in both countries, but particularly in the United States. And we can talk about that, but that is now still I would say, hanging question over this region. That if there is no stability in U.S.-Iran relations, and as a consequence, stability in Iran's relations with its neighbors, including also with Israel in the region around certain red lines that an American deal will put in place, then you're dealing with a Middle East that has all the danger elements in it, but no longer with the United States that either is present or willing to maintain order. Anyways, let me stop there and be happy to hear your thoughts. And sure, please.
Questions. And in deference to regulations as for social distancing, I was going to ask if you would be willing to moderate the question.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay.
So I'll be happy to hear your, yes, Rashad.
Thank you so much, Vali. There's a lot of things that I'd like to ask you, but specific questions about demonstrations in Iran. They seem to be getting more and more intense. And would you see this as something that would make Iranian regime much more close to a deal, or perhaps be more open to some kind of, because with the Ukrainian war, I mean, it might even get even worse in terms of global markets and etc. So I want to, can you just talk about that?
No, absolutely. That's actually, even as we're talking, sort of is an unknown here. I mean, the first set of these demonstrations happened in 2017, 2018. And I think there's a sort of an inverse psychology here. The Iranians, particularly the Revolutionary Guards, etc., came to the conclusion that either the United States and others were behind these demonstrations, which is one way always these regimes justify it, that these are agents provocateurs. But I also know that the Iranians came to the calculation that the maximum pressure sanctions was really designed about regime change, that the Trump administration was not really interested in a new nuclear deal. And if they came to the table, it would actually get worse. And secondly, that they can only come to the table with the United States if they can prove that to the United States that there's no hope of regime change. So as a result, one reason they didn't come to the table was exactly because there were demonstrations. So now also, if at this moment they come, they don't want the US to sort of construe that the reason they're coming is because they are weak, because then they would think that the US is going to keep asking for more. I mean, there's also a lack of trust both sides, because since we've walked away from the deal once, there is that issue. But having said that, I think there is a debate inside Iran between those who actually think that Iran does need certain level of stability and some degree of money coming into its economy, and it needs a deal. And then those who think that the US is not going to actually lift sanctions, and anyways, in 2 years' time, the Republicans are going to be back, and who knows what will happen, and that Iran cannot go to negotiations during demonstrations because it's the wrong message. And on the other hand, I also think that over the past 3-4 years, and this may be false, I would say, confidence, but I think there is a confidence among Iran's rulers, the deep state, let's say, that these demonstrations are venting of frustration, but they don't have a national backbone, right? There is frustration about the economic situation, but they are not regime threatening. They're not going to become like 2009 with millions of people. So they're sporadic, they can be managed, they can be contained by show of force. They may be wrong about that. I'm not saying they're correct, but I think there is an element of that as well. Yes, sir.
You're back in your office and you get a phone call from the White House and you're asked to come in and advise the president on how he should handle his engagement with Saudi Arabia, and specifically said that during the campaign that he was going to make Saudi a pariah state. If he does go to Saudi Arabia, how should he do it, and will what he does be a tactical solution, or can it go and lead to some kind of a contribute to a strategic policy?
I think he mishandled Saudi Arabia from the beginning. I mean, again, it goes to the fundamental issue I raised at the beginning, that ours is the only foreign policy that is divided between its values and national interest. And it depends on the day of the week this happens. It's not, yes, it's true that the Khashoggi thing went a bridge too far in terms of it was extremely difficult for anybody to deny what had happened. But I think the president, his advisors he was told, and his advisors probably were aware that, look, Saudi Arabia does hold the key, and that is energy prices. And if they don't pump enough, if they, you cannot be simultaneously keeping Iran out, Venezuela out, and then now Russia out, and yet expect that the one country that actually can really, pump a lot more, treat them that way. So you have to choose: is your values more important, or is national interest more important? And I think he remained divided on this, and perhaps personally he, decided to keep, the ruler of Saudi Arabia, MBS, at an arm's length, and MBS sort of took offense, and ultimately now says, well, you need me, right? So I don't think that the trip will really become anything strategic, because I don't think you can just jump over the gulf of distrust, number one. Number two is that, Persian Gulf monarchies may have already calculated that the days of the Democrats are numbered anyways, right? There's going to be midterm elections, chances of Republicans coming back might be higher. And also, just because the president is making a tactical move does not mean that they need to buy it as a strategic move, right? They're thinking much longer term, which is the United States is gone. The Khashoggi issue is sort of hanging. A lot of the Democrats have bad feelings about the progressive wing of the party about Saudi Arabia. So why would we, go out of our way to help? So yeah, they may pump a little bit more, but not much more. And then there's other side to it too. The Saudis are also looking at Putin. And do they really want to undermine him? I always am reminded that, when the West treated MBS as a pariah, there was a G20 meeting, some of you may remember, where Putin came in the room and nobody was talking to Mohammed bin Salman, and he was timid sitting there, and he gave him a massive high five, right? I think that matters. Even in a Bedouin culture, he showed him friendship, supported him at a time when he was in need. And here's the United States basically dissing him, and the moment say, well, I'm going to show up in Riyadh and I expect you to just basically forgive and forget. I just don't think it's going to be that simple. And then finally, unless we can convince the Saudis and others that we are really in the Middle East for the long run, their approach with us will be tactical as well. And now, after 3 presidents and then watching Ukraine, I think they've come to a conclusion that our approach to the region does not have a real clear strategic vision to it. And that's why they're talking to Iran, they're talking to Israel, they're talking to Russia, to China. They want to sort of show independence. I think it's important, whether one likes MBS or not to sort of get sucked into our own internal debates. He's in charge of a country. He's also playing chess here. You have to look at it from his side of the table and see how is he seeing the table and see how he's going to play. But I generally don't think there's a strategic play here right now. Yes?
You mentioned that we have right now a Shia government in Iraq that's seeking some sort of relative neutrality between Iran and the Sunni Arab states. Do you see this sort of third way that this Shia government is taking as a sort of a viable sort of axis that these emergent Shia governments could take? Is it only a strategic one, or is there also a sort of ideological bent to it? Because you have these traditions of Shia socialism and Islamism.
It's all true, but in the sense of weight of history matters. Although you now have a generation, like maybe 65% of Iraqis who were born after the Republic of Fear. They don't remember Saddam years, and they were born after the American invasion. So perceptions may begin to change. There is no doubt there is Iraqi nationalism. But you see, where I think the way we make a mistake is to think that nationalism means you don't have identity. Look, this country for the longest period of time, it's been American nationalism, but it has meant American Protestant white nationalism. How many non-Protestant presidents have we had? I think 2, right? How many non-Christian presidents we've had? So when people go into the voting booth, they're not thinking necessarily that I'm voting Christian, but that's the way they vote, right? It was true of India. When India became independent, they all said we're secular, we're socialist. But every Muslim in India understood there's never ever going to be a Muslim prime minister of India. Because the average Indian will not vote for a Muslim, right? So, now, yes, there is Iraqi nationalism, but the majority of the population are Shia. And still, there is a sense of these are Sunni parties, these are Shia parties. So people vote for them. They may vote for a Shia candidate who is more overreaching to Sunnis as opposed to being very sectarian. But I think all the Shias have a sense that this is their country, they're the majority. The way Hindus are majority in India. Yes, Muslims have a right, should have a right to everything under the constitution, but the identity of India, even though it's secular, the identity of India is Hindu. Israel is a democracy, its identity is Jewish. You would say 20-30% of the population are Arab. Saudi Arabia, 10-15% are Shia. The identity of the country is Sunni. So in that sense, the idea if by secularism American thinks that somehow Shias are going to be denying their own identity, that's actually doesn't work anywhere in the world, right? And there is among even the Shias, there is a sense of pride and nationalism that they don't want to be beholden to Iran. They don't want to be beholden to anybody. But the reality of it is that early on when they came to power, they faced a very stiff resistance from the Sunni countries around them. Saudi Arabia was the last country to actually recognize them and open an embassy, and that was about a decade more after American invasion. The only country that helped them was Iran. So you may resent them. You may resent Iranian heavy-handedness, but they know that they need Iran because they're the only Shia Arab government in a sea of Sunni governments. And so they would like to get to a place where they could balance. But the reality is also, since the invasion, they have become too dependent on Iran. And Iran has penetrated their politics and culture and society and militias, etc., in a way that it's not like Iranians are going to say, well, it was good knowing you, we're just going to go back to where we were. Because also the Iranians fear that if they leave, who's going to replace them? So it's much too complicated in terms of interest, regional interest, internal interest within Iraq, that to say that simply you're going to have a prime minister in Iraq who's going to make that decision. And then we gave Iraq a constitution that is fantastically dysfunctional, right? I mean, that's the way we wrote it, that every government has to accommodate so many different people to get there. You can't build coalitions without giving a lot away. So that automatically means there's no decisive government. There's nobody who going to come to office with 60-70% of the vote in Iraq and say, I have the people's mandate. I mean, look, how many months it's been they can't form a government? I don't know, when was the election? It was like 4 months ago? And they can't even form a government. So when they do, it's not going to be able to move with that kind of rapidity. I mean, Iraq functioned best, actually, ironically, relatively speaking, when the United States and Iran had some kind of a onset sort of agreement over the government, right? We're going to support the same prime minister, but the more issues between Iran and the U.S. has become terse, the more Iraq is a battleground between them. And so for Iran, it's not about Iraq, it's about the U.S. And for U.S., it's not about Iraq, it's largely about Iran. And so for that reason, I just don't see this easily resolving itself. Yes?
You mentioned that President Trump ended the war on terror by shifting the focus to the border, but could one make the argument that from the very beginning, the war on terror had a domestic manifestation too, which was about hyper-militarizing the border, violating asylum laws, and abusing dark-skinned asylum seekers and refugees, particularly Haitians. And now the same policies are continuing, especially as our grotesque effect on climate change is increased. There's going to be more immigrants coming. So could this be a new phase of the war on terror and not its end?
Well, I mean, look, the war on terror did create certain infrastructure you're talking about. I mean, we're all living with that, like the fact that if you get a ticket in North Carolina, the state of Washington wouldn't issue your driver's license because all of the different computer systems were connected to each other, or the purview of police or other security forces' ability to gather information, etc., grew, right? So there is an infrastructure created, but where it, and there is a larger issue about what did the war on terror do to the United States itself. Right? I mean, in fact, there's a book by one scholar, Spencer Ackerman, who argues that actually the roots of January 6th goes back really to war on terror. So that's a whole different conversation. In other words, what did that kind of anti-terror approach do to American mentality itself? But as far as what I'm trying to say is, as far as war on terror was a Middle East strategy, right? Even though when it began to lose its logic, it was domestically too sticky for anybody to move away from it, right? Because you get lambasted for being soft on terrorism. And then you were just one bomb away from, losing your reputation. So where Trump basically, not that, as I said, he set out to change Middle East strategy, but he largely, basically by arguing that, our focus ought to be on migration around us, and obviously using the same infrastructure as you're mentioning, he changed the American perspective on the Middle East itself, right? So it provided a great deal of room to say, well, look, really, terrorism is not worth trillions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of American troops, right? Or we can do it over the horizon, as they say. So he basically lifted this fog from domestic American politics, and because of who he was, the most pro-war faction of the United States didn't say anything. I mean, imagine if President Obama had initiated talking to the Taliban, right? He would have been eaten alive. I mean, when he started talking to the Taliban, none of the neocons in Senate, Senator Cotton, Senator Graham, none of them said boo. They only began criticizing talks to the Taliban after Biden came in, right? So there was that about him. I mean, I don't want to say that I guess we do owe him a debt of sort of lifting this war on terror, at least as far as the Middle East is concerned. But it was an unintended consequence of the way he saw the world, which is the Middle East is not worth our time, right? We should be focused on China, and we should be focused on Mexicans, quote unquote. That's the way he saw it. So he removed the Middle East as kind of like the single most important object of American foreign policy making. And look, it has a lot of consequences. For 2 decades after 9/11, American military was built around the Middle East. I mean, there are actually facts on the ground. CENTCOM, as you know, the Central Command, became the most important command of the US military, right? It was all built around this idea of security in the Middle East. And Pentagon would have resisted any notion that, there's no security threat in the Middle East. But even Pentagon couldn't necessarily go out against Trump. In some ways, was the most powerful civilian president in our recent times when it comes to managing the US military. I mean, he had reasserted absolute, civilian control over the military. I mean, which other president would have gone out and made fun of generals and got away with the very base that actually loves those generals, right? So it changed that balance. I mean, the idea that CENTCOM would begin to withdraw from the region and reduce its presence, that we would actually close. None of this would be possible under the kind of political climate that existed before Trump.
Well, I think
that's it.
We came, or at least I came here with a lot of questions, which you've answered, and thank you very much. But on the other hand, I'm feeling that we're also a little bit more afraid.
Well, we have many reasons to be afraid these days, and I think Middle East is not necessarily the for once it's the one thing that we should. But I think the larger issue you mentioned, Terry, is that we haven't solved the issue in the Middle East just because there are other bigger issues. So some of these issues strategically, politically, are going to be with us for some time. And at least as far as the life of a university goes, I think doing research and work on this region continues to be very important.
And that's a very hopeful thing. So on that note.
Thank you.